I just was always a wild, loose kid in my neighborhood. I just always went for mine. I maintained myself. I knew how to hustle, and I definitely wasn't no punk.
These little running around like I wasn't brought up. I was brought up toting slammers. Like, so my belt had to be extra tight. You feel me? Like
the first game, my nigga Punch Jim was popping, homie. Cat boy, I still fuck with you already know. I shout out to Melly and everybody. I still fuck with my in Harlem. It's all good.
There's always been a razor-thin line between hip-hop fame and real street respect. And one night in New York, Raw Diggs made sure Jim Jones learned exactly where that line was drawn. This wasn't gossip or online chatter. This was one of those moments that shot through every block, every barbershop, every corner where people debate who's genuinely built for the streets. Jim Jones was on top of the world at the time. Dipset was blazing hot, Ballin' was everywhere, and he moved like Harlem royalty. But Brooklyn? Brooklyn didn't kneel for anybody. And that's where Raw Diggs stepped in, a man whose name carried weight long before a single bar hit the radio. Back then, Raw Diggs wasn't just a rapper. He was a certified street commander. His reputation ran deep. Ex-con, respected in the projects, moving like a boss before the industry even whispered his name. Mention Raw Diggs, and voices dropped. He had connections, soldiers, and a code he actually lived by. So when Jim Jones slid through Brooklyn talking slick and dripping with Harlem bravado, people noticed, especially Raw.
I'm from the era where we sold the drugs, we didn't use them per se. That was the quote-unquote.
It all kicked off at a Brooklyn club event, one of those industry meets street kind of nights. Jim Jones showed up with a full entourage, shining heavy, popping bottles, letting everyone know Dipset had touched down. He had the shades, the swagger, the full Harlem aura. But something about the night felt off. Word is, Jim's crew got into it with some local dudes over seating or bottle service, and those locals just happened to be tied to Raw Diggs. Within minutes, the message reached Raw, and when he walked in, the entire atmosphere flipped. Witnesses swear the room shifted. The music felt lower. People stepped aside. Raw Diggs moved in calm, carrying presence without saying a word. He checked Jim straight up. "You good, homie? You know where you at?" And just like that, the mood changed. Jim tried to keep it smooth, but Raw wasn't there for any superstar performance. He told him, "Ain't no cameras out here. Respect goes both ways." Everyone watching knew this wasn't a conversation. It was a reality check. And the wildest part? Jim didn't argue, swing, or make noise. He nodded, tried to ease things down, and Raw simply turned around and walked out. But the silence that followed was loud. People said it looked like a superstar realizing that in another man's territory, he's just another face.
You blood from this day on, when you see us throw it up, you be putting way more work in than half these bloods that be out here and things like that. So you the homie now. When you see us throw it up, that's just that.
To understand why that moment hit so hard, you gotta know who Raw Diggs truly was. Born Ronald Herron, he wasn't some rapper pretending to be tough. He came out of the Gowanus houses in Brooklyn, the kind of place where you either build power or get crushed by the environment. Raw was known in the streets long before music ever entered the picture. By the time he touched a mic, he already had a name that commanded fear and respect. When he spoke, people paid attention, not because of bars, but because he lived the code old school New York was built on long before fame started washing it away. So when Raw Diggs and Jim Jones crossed paths, it wasn't just a clash of personalities, it was two cultures colliding, Harlem flash versus Brooklyn discipline. Jim brought that Dipset style, colorful, loud, confident. Raw Diggs embodied Brooklyn, raw, militant, deadly serious. And that night, Harlem swagger didn't hold any weight. The story says Raw wasn't trying to start a war, he was setting the line. Word was Jim's crew disrespected locals, throwing money and attitude like they ran the spot. Raw pulled up to remind him, "This ain't your block, this is mine."
They allege that Herron is guilty of racketeering charges for running a drug-dealing operation in the Gowanus housing development where he grew up. They also claim he was involved in 3 murders and 3 attempted murders.
The story spread fast because everyone who witnessed it told the exact same version. Raw didn't shout,
Didn't flex, didn't throw threats. He just checked Jim calmly, right in front of everybody. And that calm, that's what made it legendary. He didn't need noise to command a room. People said Jim's whole vibe shifted after that. No more loud Harlem bravado, no more chest-out swagger. He understood the moment instantly. Even without a single punch thrown, the whole thing turned into street folklore. That was the night Brooklyn reminded Harlem who controlled the ground, at least for that moment. Afterward, whispers flooded the city. Jim got pressed by Raw Diggs, he backed down in Brooklyn, Raw made him respect the soil. Whether the details got stretched or not, the story stuck. And once something like that attaches itself to your name in New York, it becomes permanent. Even years later, when Raw Diggs got caught up in his federal case and ended up serving life, people still brought that night up as proof of how solid he really was. They'd say, yeah, he was wild, but he stood on what he believed in, even with celebrities. That encounter became part of his myth. The moment he reminded the industry that fame doesn't cross certain lines.
Rod Diggs got 3 life sentences. You heard about this?
I actually seen it on, I think it was on your website yesterday, and I was like, and I feel bad.
For Jim Jones, that night was a wake-up call. Jim has always been a hustler, always moved with confidence, but even he couldn't ignore how that moment hit his street image. Harlem still loved him, no question, but outside his territory, people kept whispering. Anytime he talked tough in interviews or rapped about being in the trenches, fans would drop comments like, yeah, but what about Raw Diggs? It became the one story nobody would let die. What's crazy is Jim never addressed it, not once. He didn't confirm it, didn't deny it, and that silence said everything. Because if it was fake, people expected Jim to shut it down immediately. Instead, he stayed quiet, maybe realizing some stories are better left untouched. Behind the scenes, folks close to him said that moment changed his whole approach. After that night, he moved different, rolled with fewer people, popped out less in Brooklyn, focused more on business than street appearances. Almost like Raw's little check turned into a reality reset, a reminder that fame doesn't protect you from the rules of the pavement. Meanwhile, Raw Diggs became a symbol of real New York energy, the type that never needed clout. Even after his conviction, his name refused to fade. Rappers referenced him, street dudes told stories about his mix of respect and danger. They'd say, he treated you right if you moved right, and could flip the whole room if you didn't. That balance is what separated him from the rest. When documentaries about old school New York started popping up, this story always resurfaced. The night Raw Diggs humbled Jim Jones, not because they had beef, but because it exposed something deeper. It showed how fast ego gets checked when it steps outside its home turf. To fans, it was more than gossip. It was a reminder that the streets aren't a stage. You can't rent respect. You earn it in those rooms. Even today, that story still floats around whenever Jim's street credibility comes up. Some people swear it's exaggerated. Others claim they watched it unfold with their own eyes. But the message never changes. No matter how big your name gets, there's always someone quieter, realer, and ready to remind you where you're standing if you forget. In the end, that night became part of New York hip-hop legend. Not for violence, not for drama, but for principle. Raw Diggs didn't step to Jim to embarrass him. He did it to keep the code intact. Respect over reputation, always. And that's something the new generation rarely sees. For Jim, it wasn't a loss. It was a lesson. Since then, he's evolved. Businessman, family man, motivator. Maybe that moment pushed him to grow faster. The Jim who used to live for confrontation slowly gave way to a sharper, more calculated version of himself. But the streets, they never forget. Every city has a story like this, but this one involved names big enough to echo for decades. As for Raw Diggs, his legacy became layered. Some remember the music that never fully reached its peak. Others remember him as the last of a certain breed, loyal, fearless, and principled.
Even behind bars, his name carries weight, because whether you liked him or feared him, you couldn't deny he stood for something real. The lesson in all of this: you can buy jewelry, cars, fame, and followers, but you can't buy respect. That's earned in rooms with no cameras, during moments when pride collides with power. And that night in Brooklyn, Raw Diggs showed exactly what that looked like. So yeah, the day he humbled Jim Jones wasn't just gossip. It was a turning point, a reminder that Harlem may have the shine, but Brooklyn has the code. And when those worlds collided, everyone remembered who walked out with their respect untouched. Because in this game, whether you're a rapper, fighter, or boss, the rule never changes. You can't fake real. And Raw Diggs didn't have to raise his voice to prove it. That night became one of those rare stories the streets will never stop repeating. Because it wasn't just about Raw or Jim, it was about what happens when image meets reality. Fame can make a man forget where he's standing, but the streets will always remind him. Raw didn't need cameras, viral moments, or flashy chains. His presence alone said enough. He didn't threaten, didn't posture. He simply looked a man in the eyes and reminded him that respect isn't impressed by fame. Something this new generation often forgets. It's not about who's loudest online. It's about who stands solid when the lights go off. And though Jim Jones never spoke on it, that night became part of his journey. Sometimes silence is the closest thing to acceptance. Meanwhile, Raw Diggs sits behind bars, but his legend keeps breathing. People still talk about how he moved, how he never bowed, how his name still rings past borough lines. He represented that old school New York spirit, where your word had value and your reputation came from action, not followers. You might not agree with everything he did, but one thing's undeniable: he stood on business. And that's what makes this story timeless. It's not about glorifying the streets, it's about remembering what they were built on: loyalty, integrity, discipline, the kind of code that separated the real from the noise.